أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
Kitab suci Al-Quran diturunkan kepada seluruh umat manusia, huda linnasi wa bainati minal huda wal furqan, sekaligus pembeda antara hak dan batil.
Observe the activities of Jesus Christ.
I want you to pay careful attention to how Craig is phrasing his answers, because smart scholar. The Gospels are in essential agreement with one another, and we all know what Jesus says. E.P. Sanders, about how we know what Jesus said. E.P. Sanders agrees with me that there are among the Gospels, and there's unreliable information scattered throughout the Gospels. So if Craig agrees with me, because he says that there's adapted the words of Jesus, that means they changed the words of Jesus. If they changed the words of Jesus, then how do we know where they've changed when we're actually reading the words of Jesus? The same thing applies to deeds. Can we let the Gospels say about what Jesus did? If the stories about Jesus were sometimes changed and retold the stories as they adapted them, so that they weren't changed a lot before the Gospels were written down? Or are we to think that all four Gospels are 100% accurate with respect to Jesus' activities? If they're 100% accurate, how do we know that they're at all accurate? And if we don't know how accurate they are, the sources. My own view is that it is absolutely certain that the Gospels did not give an account of the things that Jesus did. For one thing, there are many discrepancies in the accounts. As you for yourself, comparing the Gospel stories from any of the Gospels and compare it in detail, just do it yourself. Compare it in detail with the same story in another Gospel. You'll see multiple differences. But some things are not simply different in minor, deep in major ways. Let me give you just one example. To his death in the Gospel of Mark is completely silent. His cross, or Simon of Cyrene carries his cross, and Jesus doesn't say a word. They nail him to the cross, and he's silent. He's hanging across. Both robbers mock him, the passers-by mock him, and he doesn't say anything until the very end. He cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. That's the end of the story. Not quite, because then he gets raised from the dead. We feel at the end. Compare that with the Gospel of Luke. Luke, Jesus is not silent on the way to be crucified. He sees some women weeping for him by the side of the road, and he turns to them and says, daughters, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children, for the fate that's to befall you. Luke's Gospel is more concerned about these women than he is about his own fate. To the cross, in Luke's Gospel, he's not, Father, forgive them, for they don't. He's hanging on the cross, and he has an intelligent conversation with one of the robbers. Only one of the robbers mocks him in Luke. The other robber to be quiet because Jesus has done nothing to deserve this. He turns and says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And in Luke's Gospel, Jesus does not feel forsaken. In Luke's Gospel, he's outside. God is behind the proceeding. He knows why it's going to happen to him. He knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. And this guy's going to be with him in Luke's Gospel. Rather than crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He doesn't say, Luke's Gospel, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. This is a very different portrayal of Jesus going to his death. But they take Mark's account and they take Luke's account and they smash them together into one big account. Says in Mark, everything he says in Luke, then he says in Matthew, and what he says in John, and you end up words of the dying Jesus, which you find in none of the Gospels. Free to do that, to smash them all together. Trail isn't right, Luke's isn't right. What's right is the one that you've combined. What you've done is you've written your own Gospels of the New Testament. Gospels of the New Testament do not agree either on the sayings of Jesus or on the deeds.
An eyewitness tradition.
When I was a Bible-believing evangelical attending Moody Bible Leadership on the New Testament, getting Greek, serious scholars of the world had to say about it, I was that the Gospels not only contained eyewitness tradition, written by two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by close companions to people who were eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. Research has a way of changing your mind about things, but I do use your brain. Hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you sure God gave you a brain. God gave you to think with. Apply reason. That's what a human being instead of a slug. Afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may be what you were taught, but believe it, not run. As I studied more, using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. The first point is an obvious one, that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are the titles in the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth were not put there by the original authors. Second point, the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not about 100 years. Some people, early church father named Papias, who attests to the of Mark and Matthew, but in fact, reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Matthew. The first time to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. Of the Gospels, as they come down to us, is that and we don't know their names, and they're not testimony. But the important that I want to make is that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, guarantee that they were accurate. Think about the system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate? If trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness. If I've been accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need lists. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask somebody. I would always get all the information right. It wouldn't matter. The New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They're not written by eyewitnesses. The writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. These Gospel writers were living in a decades later, information from they don't claim to be followers of Jesus. The disciples written by later people decades later in a different language. Where did they get information from? They heard about Jesus that had been year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time of writers living in a different country, speaking a different language. Stories. What happens when they are transmitted orally? The Gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves. Stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and sometimes why there are discrepancies. That's generally what Jesus was about. They can things that Jesus did, tell you the details and agree. Why? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are.